the ineptitude of Michigan's offense, they had absolutely no business being 8-5 this season. But somehow Michigan and Sharon Moore, they pulled it off, all things considered. And I think they're one of those teams that really didn't get a lot of credit, partially probably because they won the 2023 national championship and it was Sharon Moore's first year. And I think kind of all those factors combined with Ohio State kind of finishing their story and winning the national title and them not being in the Big Ten picture as much. In many ways, nobody's really talked about them as much. And it seems fitting to me, given the progress that they've made, that they deserve a shout out and they deserve some recognition for what they've done. Now, at least on the offensive side of the ball, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds in terms of just how abysmal their offense was, but particularly in the passing game. I mean, you're 130 out of 134 in the country passing, and the only teams that were worse than you were the service academies and Iowa. I mean, that was one of the big questions even going into the year. Is I was a little bit more of a fan of Alex Ogie, but they also went ahead and went with Davis Warren too. And it was a fun story watching him. Walk on quarterback, earned his way up, but when he tore his ACL in that bowl game versus Alabama, I mean that story probably has ended now, because at this point you have Mikey Keene, who's a transfer from Fresno State and also was a quarterback under Chip Lindsey previously. But you also have Bryce Underwood, who you managed to steal away from LSU, one of the top prospects in all of the 2024-2025 class. And now that you sit there and you have Bryce Underwood under your radar now, under your team, you sit there and ask yourself, okay, who are we going to go with here? Are we going to go with the guy who has experience and somebody who has been a gunslinger everywhere he's went? When he was at Fresno State, he had over 3,000 yards passing and for the most part found open receivers and kind of had more of an air raid sort of offense. Whereas Bryce Underwood, you're banking on the potential. You're banking on his film, which is phenomenal, by the way. He is the real deal. He is a generational talent, and there's a reason why he's the number one overall prospect in the 2025 class. And there's a reason why LSU, needless to say, was pretty pissed off when Michigan was able to steal him away. But at the same time, the NIL money came through, and I'm assuming he probably just got a deal that he couldn't refuse. But you sit there at the same time and say to yourself, man, this is going to be a really large project for Chip Lindsey and this offensive staff, because you go back and watch some of these games previously. I think about that Texas game where they were just getting sacked every other play. I sit there and ask myself about the Ohio State game. Yes, they did win that game, and yes, it's a big win for them, and it was kind of the cherry on top for their season, aside from the Alabama bowl victory. But at the same time, too, much like my video on Texas A&M, Michigan's going to have a similar problem in the sense of the way that it's shaking out right now. If Mikey Keene does end up being their starting quarterback, you have to imagine that the playbook is seriously going to be opened up to the point where I think we're going to see a little bit more of an air raid style. I think it's going to be a lot more pass heavy than we've seen in previous Michigan teams. And I just don't know right now if they have the wide receiving core to be able to do that immediately. And yes, they've recruited 23 recruits, 2 5-stars, 14 4-stars, which I believe is top 10 in the country. So they're doing really good in that front. And Sharon Moore deserves a lot of credit for what he's done. Now, I think it's fairly obvious that he was kind of the next man up in terms of, Jim Harbaugh leaving for the LA Chargers. But at the same time, too, this is a really tall order. But at the same time, too, you remind yourself that Michigan is a team about having an identity, and they're consistent and they're disciplined. And that's the one thing that I think you have to give the Wolverines credit for this year is the transition to Sharon Moore. That discipline, that culture, that structure has been the same. And Granted, you're not going to sit there and say Sharon Moore necessarily created that culture, but at the same time, the wheels didn't fall off the tracks. And this easily could have been a team that went 500 at best given the offensive play. And granted, too, it's just a little bit disappointing for Donovan Edwards. Only had about 500 yards, 4 touchdowns, and you definitely would have thought he'd be a little bit more involved. But with some of the injuries that he's had and the overall predictability of their offense, and you also having the defense just out there for that long, it was kind of a recipe for disaster. And in many ways, it just made them not competitive against some of the stronger teams on their schedule. Because even if you go back and look at Michigan's defense, they deserve a ton of credit for the ability to keep them in games, and also just that relenting pass rush, starting off with Mason Graham on the defensive line and obviously Will Johnson in the secondary. Now, granted, if Will Johnson wasn't as hurt for as many games, I think we'd be having a little bit of a different conversation in terms of where Michigan is at, and perhaps even in terms of maybe talking about them as a 9 or a 10 win team. Because, for example, I think they had a little bit more help on the secondary side of the ball. They weren't as banged up a little bit, and they weren't necessarily relying on that front four to just get to the quarterback over and over and over again. Now, granted, they were excellent in terms of stopping the run, and they do deserve credit for that. And I think the linebacking core there also doesn't get enough credit, as they, all things considered, are one of the better teams in the country in terms of tackling and not giving up too many mistakes. But at the same time, when you're in the Big Ten, those are the battles, and those are the matchups that you're going to be talking about week after week after week in terms of the battle in the trenches. Which quarterback's going to make less mistakes? Who is going to shine in the bright moments, and who's going to have that right decision making? Because I think even if you go back and look at some of Mikey Keene's pass stops, sometimes the decision making has been a little bit questionable in the sense of him just being overly aggressive. It's not so much that he doesn't have the arm, he doesn't have the leadership ability or the overall talent, because I think he has every single one of those things. It's just that Chip Lindsey and Sharon Moore are going to have to sit there and ask themselves, are we going to bank on experience at this point or potential? But at the same time, you don't necessarily know what the pitch was to Bryce Underwood, aside from just a bunch of NIL money from Dave Portnoy. Now, if that was just the pitch and that was it, if you're Bryce Underwood, hey, maybe it's not that big of a deal that you sit for a year, learn behind a guy behind Mikey Keene, and if he does get injured or if he does struggle, hey, your moment's there and you're ready to go. But again, when you're at Ann Arbor and you play in the big house, the expectations are going to be there every single season, no matter what you do. But as you look at this team and as you figure out all the pieces here, they've done a phenomenal job at keeping up with the recruiting. The defense, I believe, is still going to be as strong as ever and still going to be the general foundation of this team, even though Sharon Moore has an offensive background. And although they are completely loading up in terms of some offensive weapons, in terms of their recruiting, they usually don't really attack the transfer portal too much. I do think they're going to try to add Ty Hagwood. He was originally supposed to be, or Ty Haywood, that's his name. Ty Haywood originally committed to Alabama, and now he's kind of flirting with some other teams. And I think Michigan would be an excellent fit for him, because they can definitely use another offensive lineman to really solidify that depth and also just give their quarterback a little bit more confidence going into next season. But with that said, when you have a generational talent who's the number one in your class, you have a guy in Mikey Keene that you can at least rely on at the beginning of the season. But again, I still think the wide receiving core is going to be a big question mark, because obviously Colton Loveland was your top receiver last year, who was a tight end, and I just don't think that's going to be sustainable if they want to get back to kind of flirting with being a big threat in the Big Ten. But overall, they really do have all the pieces necessary to make that next step under Sharon Moore. It's just going to be more or less of how many of these guys are going to be immediate contributors and how quickly can they get this passing attack ready to go. It's going to be a big test, and a lot of teams are going to have some eyes on them.